I have been thinking a lot about structural interventions for about 15 years, but I hope my presentation isn't a disappointment. I'm not sure I know the answer to what makes something structural. I am really taking this opportunity from this presentation to kind of reflect over the last 15 years that I've been thinking about this, and the people that I've been reading in the field, and thinking about some of the new and kind of more nuanced development in that thinking that's been going on over this time, and what it might mean for moving forward. So I'm sorry if I don't have an answer to what is structural, but hopefully I'll have something interesting to say. I will talk about a couple of my specific projects, at the end of the presentation. I won't be able to say too much, I don't think, depending on how much time this all takes in between, but I can answer questions about specific projects as well. But I'm really trying to, just in my own thinking, just think about where we are at this point, and so I tried to use this as an opportunity to do that. And so we'll see what you think. I think there's a range of people familiar with this literature on the call, and so hopefully there'll be something for most of you. What I thought I'd start with is some basics about structural interventions that probably everybody knows, but just to remind us, and then move to some of the more nuanced issues that I think have emerged as this discussion has expanded over the last decade plus. And I just briefly want to then mention some things that I'm just thinking about. I'm not sure that I think might make HIV/AIDS particularly distinct. I won't say completely unique, but distinct and maybe particularly complicated in the context of structural interventions. And then maybe what I see to be some of the major big questions that remain, and then briefly tell you something about some of the work that I'm doing. So just to start off with, yes, structural interventions oftentimes are contrasted with other types of interventions, particularly behavioral and biological interventions. And some of the ways in which this is done by noting, first of all, that behavioral interventions, in a behavioral approach, usually individuals are treated as free and autonomous and making their own decisions about health and largely responsible for their own health. The focus is with these interventions, the focus is on behavior change, and a lot of times that is accomplished through provision of information and skills. And so the idea is that if people have the information they need about what makes them sick or what will make them healthy, then they will act on that information. And so that is where the focus is. So health is then under the purview and is the responsibility in that view of individuals. Another common intervention strategy is more focused on biological causes and biological processes. And in some instances, there may be some sense in which there's not much that can be done about biological processes. But for the most part, the focus is really on the development, in this view, of medical technologies, things like drugs that can intervene in biological processes or to either eliminate or reduce disease or risk of disease, particular types of equipment or tools or procedures and so forth. That could be used to address the health problem, and certainly we see this many biological approaches in HIV. And in this view, health then is the responsibility of medicine and biomedical science. In the structural interventions, at the most simplistic levels, we know health is viewed as a product of social processes, social relations, social structures. Sometimes some people use all of these words, some people use one of them, but basically you can see moving outside of the individual per se, or either as a biological entity or as a social entity, and moving to look at the larger circumstances and social conditions, social processes, etc., that shape individuals. And so the focus of research, or at least some research, and then of the development of interventions, oftentimes involves understanding and paying attention to, at least in some form, these processes, relations, and structures. How do they work to shape health? And in this view, health is viewed as a community or a social responsibility. So not so much put in the hands of individuals or in the hands of biomedical science, but becomes something that societies and communities are viewed as responsible for. And to some extent, this attention to structural interventions reflects perception that these other two approaches, biological and biomedical, are limited. And to some extent, I think it reflects a demand on the part of social scientists, people concerned about social sciences and social aspects of health, activists and so forth, to participate in discussions of health. With regard to some of the limitations, some of the limitations that are identified of these different approaches, behavioral approaches are limited because we know that information and skills in the hand of individuals alone has only limited success in changing health behaviors. So many people know what the practices are that are leading to their health problems. In the case of HIV, that are leading to HIV, they know what behaviors are increasing the likelihood that they will transmit or be infected by HIV. But even so, people continue to get infected. And biological technologies that work under laboratory conditions and test conditions don't always work very well in translation outside of the laboratory. And these don't even have to be particularly complicated biological or biomedical kinds of interventions. Even something as simple as a condom, which works really well in a laboratory setting, is very hard to implement its regular use in social world. And so the understanding is that these interventions are limited in their ability to address the health problem because neither of them really completely understands their embeddedness and the embeddedness of health, or really the embeddedness of behaviors and biological technologies in the social world. These are not independent of the social world. And we can even take this further, this criticism of so oftentimes I feel like the structural intervention sort of starts, it's almost like these are straw people that are set up, or straw arguments in a way, and the criticisms are somewhat simplistic, but I think they can even be taken further, the criticisms of these behavioral and biomedical approaches, or the approach that focuses on information, and recognizing that information itself isn't even as simple to convey or whatever as we might think it is. That information itself, what information people have access to, what forms that information takes, when it's provided, where it's provided, those are also social products. So in the United States, for example, there are school districts around the country in certain particular areas where adolescents do not have access to information about contraception and about sex. Those school districts are required to offer sex education programs that focus on abstinence only. And so by virtue of their social setting or their location, their access to information and the type of information that they have access to is restricted. So even provision of information again, the kinds of information that people have available to them, the way that information is presented is itself can be conceptualized as a social product. And similarly, biomedical technologies are created in a social environment. The science is not some kind of value neutral or independent process that's just going on its own, even though sometimes we hear about, that's why sometimes we hear discussed as, kind of developed in a laboratory and then introduced into the real world as somehow that the laboratory is not part of that same social world that these technologies are introduced in. But of course that's not the case. So what technologies are the focus of what processes are the focus of technological development or whatever are socially determined. So maybe in the context of HIV, for example, there's much less focus on female-controlled contraceptions and so forth and protective technologies than there are on male control, for example, or the fact that drugs get developed or drugs of a certain type get developed and so forth. These are social things as well, social processes. And the fact even that the field or the interventions that are sort of the most common interventions are dominated by behavioral and biomedical perspectives is itself also, I think, a social phenomenon. So the fact that we focus on individual behaviors and that is reflective of a social system in which individual responsibility is a norm, and that in turn may be viewed as consistent with more broader priorities, economic and gender-based priorities and so forth. And similarly, the idea that there's so much emphasis on biomedical approaches and biomedical models is a social phenomenon that reflects the fact that we live in a world in which the biomedical is overvalued, and that too is a social phenomenon that's directed by powerful interests and so forth. And so for all of these reasons, I guess I'm just suggesting a more extensive critique of some of the limitations of the behavioral and biomedical approaches and the way in which there's not as much recognition as there could be of the social dimensions of these approaches. So how are structural interventions different? Just some of the basics to begin with. Of course, structural interventions reflect an understanding, as I said, of health, of the social aspects of health. And so sort of that means, for example, that they recognize that individuals, it's not just that individuals with regard to health, say from a more behavioral approach, it's not just that individuals are making bad choices or making unhealthy choices, but that individuals have poor choices to make. And so they may be making the best choices they can given the choices that are available to them. And that beyond just the range of choices that individuals have, they're situated, or they may be situated in circumstances or in such a way that it's it's almost impossible or very difficult for them to make healthy choices. So even if those healthy choices are out there and available to them, they may not be socially situated in a way that allows them to make those choices that are in the best interest of their health. It's also, we don't talk about this as much because I'm more focused on prevention, but structural interventions also recognize that the consequences of unhealthy choices, so to speak, are not randomly or evenly distributed. That is, if two people do, in this framework of choice, make an unhealthy choice for whatever reasons, there will be differences or there potentially could be differences in the outcomes associated with them. Some may be able to ameliorate or eliminate the consequences of those choices, and others may not. And generally, the reasons for these, from the perspective of those concerned with structural interventions, are not because of the individual characteristics per se. That is, the reason people are making unhealthy choices or are situated in ways that they can, are not a result of their own individual characteristics, but the result of social processes, structures, systems, and so forth that systematically shape the choices that they have and the consequences of those choices. So their location in the social system, the social structure, is what is accounting for this to a much greater degree than any particular individual characteristics. And so moving on in terms of what this means, again, for the purposes of interventions, again, focusing on some of the basics, that at minimum we need to start thinking about, and structural interventions think about, expanding the range of choices that are available for people to make, addressing the conditions that prevent people from making healthy choices or from being and staying healthy, address the circumstances that make certain practices unhealthy, and ensure that whatever forms of treatment and care are relevant for addressing the health problems are available for everybody. Another thing that we note about structural interventions is that they often can be implemented at different levels and are targeted, in a sense, to different levels. They can be targeted at the individual level, so it's not to say that individual behaviors and practices aren't necessarily one of the targets of structural interventions. They're just attempt to influence individual behavior in different ways. And so one way that I think these interventions can be implemented to address individuals are through incentives or penalties for certain types of behaviors, or incentives for engaging in healthy behaviors. And examples of this would be things, seatbelt laws, and things that require people to wear helmets when they're riding bicycles or motorcycles or so forth, where there's really where there's direct efforts to influence choices people make by, again, providing penalties or incentives to do those things. But these kinds of interventions can be targeted at other levels as well, so they may not be directly trying to change individual practices or whatever, but maybe they're trying to change industry practices. So they might be there might be regulations on the amount of chemicals that can go into the environment, or whether people can smoke in public spaces, and so on and so forth. So these types of interventions can be targeted at different levels in order to make changes in health, even at the individual, or making for more healthy communities and so forth. And they can also be more broadly targeted, or more fundamentally targeted at social relations of power and inequality. And arguably these relations actually can shape all these other levels and all of these other dimensions at which interventions may be targeted. So I said I've just been thinking about some ways that HIV, it says unique may be too strong of a word, but some things that make HIV distinct, and perhaps other STIs as well, and that complicate the idea of developing structural interventions to address HIV. And one of maybe the most fundamental thing I think that may make HIV distinct is that I think that it may be one disease, perhaps a type of disease as an STI, that's fundamentally relational in nature. And I mean by that the practices that lead to HIV transmission almost always require interaction with somebody else. So there are things, blood transfusions, and there are some instances where this may not be the case. But for the most part, there really has to be an interactive component. You're interacting with at least one other person, of course, especially in the case of sexual transmission, but in the case of needle drug use, transmission in the context of injection drug use, I think this is generally true. This doesn't mean that one has to be in a relationship per se with the person in order to be at risk for transmission or acquisition, but it does mean that there's an interaction involved with another person. And so it's not engaging in a particular behavior or practice, but engaging in a particular behavior or practice with someone who is infected, really. And you think of it is an infectious disease. You could say this is true of other infectious diseases, but a lot of infectious diseases you don't actually have to interact with the person. They can be just walking by you and sneeze on you or something, or they can leave viruses or whatever around in there. So I just think there's something that's important about the fact that there's an interaction, and that may make the power differences particularly important too, since it can often be the case that there are power differences in these relationships. But it also means that one has to make one thing. It seems to mean is that if you're thinking about kind of making judgments in relationships, that in order to protect yourself from acquiring HIV in the context of a particular relationship, or in order to protect someone else, it's mostly the opposite, protect yourself from acquiring it, you need to either know a person is infected, or have some sense or make judgments about how likely that is. And in the context of, particularly as the relationship becomes more intimate, that can be a difficult thing to do. Okay, so there's a couple of other things too besides this relational thing, besides the fact that it's taking place in an interaction, that also are important in thinking about what makes HIV distinct, I think. And one is that lots of the practices that can lead to HIV transmission are illegal. And often they're not illegal because they lead to HIV. They're illegal for other reasons, and that complicates the context and the ways in which we have to think about interventions. Also, the practices that can lead to HIV transmission are frequently intimate, and they frequently take place in private settings. And so I think all of these things make the project of developing interventions, and particularly structural interventions, maybe all kinds of interventions, really challenging, and particularly challenging in the context of HIV. So what are some things in terms of making structural interventions structural? Well, I've been looking at a lot of the literature and what I think to be some of the most interesting pieces that are written. And so in some early work that I did, I focused sort of broadly on structural interventions as interventions that address the social, economic, political context in which health is produced or reproduced. And that work, we were looking primarily at interventions themselves, different kinds of interventions to address public health, a wide range of different interventions, and trying to understand how those interventions had been implemented. We were not looking so much at the social drivers per se, although we recognized that social factors and social causes were implied by the different approaches that were taken. But we weren't really taking on in that work the characteristics of the environment per se. We were focusing more at the level of interventions and the different approaches that had been taken. In work by Judy Auerbach and colleagues, she defines structural interventions as structural interventions must address key drivers of HIV, and by key drivers that means core social processes, including social norms, values, networks, structures, institutions. And so in that way, the focus is really on more explicitly understanding cause of HIV in this particular case, and linking those causes to interventions, on linking the key drivers to the health outcomes and then intervening to address those. Even in that work, there's not a lot in the work that she's doing. There's not a lot of theorizing necessarily about norms and values and network structures and institutions and how they operate and so forth. But there is discussion of the need to think about that and understand that in developing interventions. And then in I think a really important piece by Justin Parkhurst that recently came out, he tells us that we need to, that structural approaches to HIV structural interventions build resilience, and they build resilience in ways that do not limit or undermine individual agency, or at least do that in ways that minimize the limitations on individual agency. And so here, in a way, the focus is not so much on the causes per se, but really on what we're trying to achieve. And what we're trying to achieve is communities or contexts of resilience to HIV. And then there's another article that I think is really important by Evans and colleagues that focuses on a particular type of structural intervention, which is community-led structural intervention. And these are interventions strategized in partnership with the community to address individual and community vulnerability, and they involve mobilization and empowerment of the community by changing existing power relations. So clearly this is a particular type of structural intervention, and there's an emphasis on understanding not only the power and the key drivers being in inequality and power differences, but in the importance of participation and partnership in the development of interventions. And so these are some of what I think are some of the most interesting and nuanced thinking about structural interventions in the kind of, contemporarily. So I guess then what I thought in reading through a lot of materials and thinking about this presentation, that where we are is not so much in answers, but in a bunch of ongoing debates that we need to really think about and that are reflected in this literature. And so I tried to put what I think some of these questions are that we need to start, that seem to be reflected in the literature that maybe we need to take on more directly. And one question is, how much do we really need to understand about the social processes and structures and systems that shape health in order to intervene effectively? Do we have to understand all of not only the logic by which these structures are operating themselves? Do we have to understand whether they are reflective of other broader forces and so forth? And how much do we really have to understand before we can develop the interventions? Also, we have to take on the question of are there some processes that are more fundamental than other processes? So are norms, values, institutions, so forth, each of them equally important? Are some more fundamental than others? And of course the implication is that how fundamental do we need to get before we can develop interventions that we are satisfied can be effective in the short and the long term? Also, how much do we need to understand about the non-HIV related and non-health impacts of interventions when we design and implement them? So if we're talking about interventions that are addressing more fundamental social processes, they're, by virtue of definition, they're likely to be not just affecting HIV, but affecting other health outcomes, and not just affecting other health outcomes, but other issues as well. And this is something that the Parkhurst article really takes on this question. How important is community participation in operationalizing, implementing, evaluating, and so forth structural interventions? Are they fundamentally a part? Is it necessary for something to be a structural intervention to involve community participation, or is that a particular type? Is that important to a particular type of intervention, but not to the definition of structural interventions per se? And then there continue to be debates about how we know. Again, all of these previous questions have implications for not only whether we can intervene effectively, but how we know if we've intervened effectively. And then, perhaps most challenging of all in terms of what we need to think about is it possible to impact on health over the long term if fundamental structures that shape health are not challenged? That is, how important is it for long-term effectiveness that structural interventions challenge underlying relations of power and the structures that I think there is this ongoing tension in the literature, and I go back and forth myself on this, but I do. My thinking at this point is that we do need to keep in mind at some level that we are talking about interventions, and interventions are different than social movements or social collective action, potentially social revolutions, social change. And in fact, in my own discipline of sociology, there really isn't a concept of intervention. It's not that common for sociologists to really even talk about interventions. It's really we tend to talk more about social action, social movements, and so forth. And so I do think that we need to take on the question of whether this is whether there is a difference between interventions and these broader issues of social change. So just a couple of things by way of moving towards an ideal. What are we? Maybe this. As I was reflecting on this yesterday after I put my slides together, I was trying to think about, okay, well, what did I really mean by this slide? Maybe this is my pie in the sky idea about what a healthy world would look like, or an AIDS resilient world, or whatever we want to call it, as well as kind of all wrapped up, as well as what we should be seeking for in structural interventions, and some thoughts about that that we would seek to, with these kinds of interventions, increase the healthy choices available to individuals and communities in ways that at minimum, do not systematically cause harm to individuals or communities. Ensure that whatever constraints are placed on choice, because we do have to always acknowledge that individual choice will likely be constrained in a social world. We want to put constraints that are not undermining social justice, or again are not leading to some form of systematic oppression. We want to ensure the ability for individuals to make healthy choices, address fundamental social processes as they manifest in a particular time and place. So people talk about the need to really recognize that there are these fundamental social processes, but we can only kind of grasp them in a particular context at a particular moment in time, and so that's where we really need to, what we really need to be focused on. We want to increase the representation and ideally the participation of all social groups in defining what our range of choices will be, because there will always be constraints and there will always be restrictions on those choices, and also the criteria according to which those choices are made. We want to try to develop interventions that will move us toward a world where health is not determined by social location. And I guess have to ask ourselves to what extent we can accomplish these goals in our current social world, which is characterized by all forms of structural processes that lead to all kinds of forms of oppression and inequality. Okay, so that's sort of broad thinking about structural interventions. Let me just say a couple of quick words about projects that I'm doing, and I know I want to make sure I give time for discussion or questions, so I'll just be really quick. I have a bunch of different projects, but I'll focus on two, and one is more focused on the social drivers of HIV/AIDS, and the other, and that's called Project SHARP, Structures, Health, and Risk Among Reentrants, Probationers, and Partners, and the other is Project Parivartan, which is more focused on implementation and impact of structural interventions, and that's part of, funded by the Gates Foundation, it's part of the Avahan program, and our focus in Project Parivartan is on community mobilization, structural interventions. So the SHARP project is looking at the involvement of criminal justice and the movement between the criminal justice system and the community and its impact on race disparities in HIV/AIDS. And in the U.S., there are tremendous race disparities with Black men about 6 times as likely to have HIV/AIDS as white men, and Black women almost 14 times as likely to have HIV/AIDS than white women. So this slide just indicates the way in which the disparities exist race disparities exist at all levels, and these coincide with disparities in the criminal justice system as well. So Blacks way overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So this is what we're looking at then. How is this phenomenon of movement between the criminal justice system and the community creating forms of instability that lead to race disparities in HIV risk, and to what extent are these a product of drug policies, which of course drug policies are part of a product themselves of a larger system of a larger system of that reflects various forms of capitalism and patriarchy and so on, and racism and so on. But we're slicing this out sort of somewhere in between all of that to focus on how our drug policies are creating this constant movement back and forth between the criminal justice community and producing disparities in HIV. And then finally, and data collection on that project is ongoing. And then just the project that we're doing with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is looking at we have this unique we've had this unique opportunity to really watch the unfolding of this community mobilization intervention that's been going on in one state in India, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and we were focused in one community for a while, and now we're expanding out into, we've been collecting data in several communities, and so we're watching this process of this community mobilization intervention unfold since 2004, and now we're following it as there's a transition in the project from where program funding is being transferred from the Gates Foundation to the government, and the implementation of community mobilization is being transferred from NGOs to community-based organizations. And this particular intervention is focused on female sex workers. So we've identified some of I've put on this slide a few of the things that we found already with regard to the impact of community mobilization, and hopefully over the next year and a half or so we'll be bringing out some of the findings that we have with respect to respect to the implementation and impact of these interventions as they go through this process of transition.
I have actually one comment here that I'll start with while people get themselves unmuted from Catherine Dodds. She says, Kim, one of the key issues I find in my work is the necessity of encouraging a wide array of actors to see themselves as agents of social change. We have a real divide in the work that happens in HIV prevention in the UK, where community-based agencies mainly regard their role to be one of individual-level behavior change, and they, quote, leave the policy and structural work to the national-level agencies and academics. I see this replicated in many places internationally. It would be interesting for us all to collectively discuss the ways in which we overcome this challenge. So this is from Catherine Dodds, who works here at LSHTM. I wonder if you have a thought that you'd like to, in relation to that, comment?
I think that's interesting. I guess the question I would have is, what do you see as to be the reason that they have that perspective? They feel that they're that they shouldn't be agents of social change, or that it's too overwhelming to take on that role, or
Catherine, do you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure, we can hear you.
I think that partly it's about being too overwhelmed by things that are coming through the door. So it's just there's too much other work to be done, and actually attending meetings and responding to policy documents feels too distant and unimportant. Mm-hmm. And I also think it is about a profound sense of disempowerment from the wider social environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I actually feel like a lot of our, community-based groups here in the U.S. are, somewhat different. I mean, I think there's a sense that these things should be, these are broader issues, and that they're contributing in their way, and that they can be contributing in ways that are more kind of community activist. I think maybe their feeling of constraint is really one of, this is what we get funded to do, and if we start to do these broader, if we start to engage in, broader, and so I see that as one of the prime challenges, and I think that is a challenge more generally, not just for community-based agencies, but anybody implementing even some forms of structural interventions. That how far can we go? We're getting paid to we're getting funded to address HIV, not necessarily these broader things, and so there's this constant issue of what the funding source and the potential constraints that places on how much of a structural intervention, how much you can address some of these more fundamental kind of processes or whatever with a structural intervention. So for me, I see that as one of the constraints that community-based agencies are dealing with.
Yeah.
This is Lori. I think we're also, as part of STRIVE, trying to take on an element of that project, or that dilemma, I should say, which is, I think that, if you're funded, the donor streams come in very vertical boluses, and as there has been the rise of sort of results-based programming and being able to demonstrate impact on a specific sector, it becomes harder and harder for groups to actually work cross-sector. And so one of the things we've been working on is how do we figure out and talk about cost sharing between HIV and, let's say, the education sector, or if it's a youth sports intervention that works on HIV between the youth ministry and the HIV ministry, and actually figuring out a way to model the cost and model the impact so that we can make some reasonable judgments about, okay, there's multiple benefits coming out of this investment upstream. And it's not just HIV, it's also education or it's youth development or whatever it may be. How do we adjust cost-effectiveness analysis so that we can, craft and capture multiple benefits? And then how do we then project that into a fiscal equation that says, okay, well, the fair sort of distribution of these costs across different donor streams or governmental streams is, HIV picks up 14% and somebody else picks up X%. So I have a question here from Anna Forbes, and she's interested in the Parivartan project, the Avahan. And she wanted to know if you could say a little bit about the distinction between what is called NGOs and CBOs, and sort of you mentioned the process underway of shifting from NGO implementation to CBO, and if you could say a bit more about that and how were the CBOs recruited or selected for participation in the Avahan project.
Okay, well, the CBOs are community-based organizations of sex workers that really emerge. Well, I think this probably varies across the Avahan program overall, but in our context, in the places where we've been observing, originally the NGOs were original implementers of the intervention. That is, and they could be local. They could be. Many of them were Indian organizations. Some of them were Indian branches, so to speak, of more international NGOs. And originally, they were implementing the intervention and encouraging, and part of that implementation process was encouraging the development of sex worker organizations, the community-based organizations. So those community-based organizations emerged as part of the initial progress, so to speak, or process of implementation of the interventions that were being implemented by the NGOs, and then the CBOs developed in various. Some of them there would be one CBO that developed that represented and worked on behalf of all of the sex work in the area. In some instances, more than one CBO developed to represent different groups of sex workers and so forth. So that was how those were how the CBOs kind of emerge. As far as selection for whether they would become implementers of the community mobilization, that's kind of ongoing, and I think there's different, my understanding just from looking at that, because we're looking at that now, from looking at some of the field notes that are coming back, that varies somewhat, but that there's a certain, the government and the groups that are implementing the NGOs are with government money are looking at the CBOs to determine, and there's a set of criteria that they're using as to whether or not they're ready to receive funds and take on intervention implementation. And that's a fascinating process, which I can't, it's all kind of jumbled up in what's going on, and we're trying to sort out some things that we can say about how they're making those judgments and so forth in terms of whether or not to hand the program over to the CBO. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. Do we have anyone else? I know we're a little bit over time, but we started a bit late, so I recognize that some people may have to sign off but we probably could take another couple of questions if anyone has one. Anna just chatted back that yes, it was very helpful. Thank you. So, anyone want to unmute themselves and venture to speak out loud?
Yeah. Hi, guys. It's James from Grassroots Soccer in Cape Town.
Okay, great.
Just two thoughts. One is a comment, maybe a little more, I just think positive. South Africa's process last year of going to developing our new 5-year HIV plan was actually really inspiring and encouraging. You know, they had made a lot of effort of engaging different sectors. So, for example, we were involved in something called the sports and entertainment sector. So we sat with everyone from entertainers to sports for development people and tried to contribute our thoughts to the initial draft. And something just speaking to what Kim was saying, really exciting for me, is the initial draft in South Africa was very heavily biomedically focused. The behavioral interventions were really toned down in the language of the first few drafts that came out. And strangely enough, the Association of People Living with HIV and AIDS in South Africa were the most vocal to say that a sense of agency and a community's ability to get involved and take action needs to come out more strongly in the document. And they were saying that the biomedical stuff makes people feel like, you know, they're at the behest of things that are done to them and to their communities, but actually that being able to take action is more empowering. So I think they were responding to this kind of discussion and the structural debates in a really, really smart way. And then the second one is just related to that. I don't know if people are really able to articulate the kind of theory behind this stuff as well as they need to, because a behavioral intervention is complicated, but you can still explain exactly what it is that you're trying to do. Biomedical one even more so, especially if you have good sort of, you know, lab data like you were saying. But a structural one seems a bit like this big grand ideas of trying to connect things, trying to work on too many things at once. And if you have a way of explaining how small actions at a CBO level or high actions at a Minister of Health level can impact things structurally, that would be really useful. So I don't know if there are any theories that you've come across that you find useful, discussions using complexity or systems thinking, ways of helping people understand that by taking action, we are in effect making a model of the way we think the world works. You know, you were talking about trying to understand the logic of a social system, and realizing that maybe we can't understand the full logic, but we have to at least try and describe what we think the logic is to enable to articulate what difference we want to try and make. And then by doing that, you realize that a small effect of a small CBO doing work can actually have really big, you know, national impacts with big structural impacts. I'm really interested in reading that Parker's article, but is there anything you want to say just about that theoretical side of things that we should look for or talk through that would be really useful?
I mean, I think that is absolutely critical, that we have to think about how we can make change, how we can take on a problem in a way that it's manageable, and that as much as possible it recognizes complexity, but we can insert ourselves in that complexity without taking it all on, because it's too overwhelming, and it's counterproductive, and so on. And I think actually Judy Auerbach, and I think Justin is also an author on that article, talks about some ways to kind of think through the process and the way that various it's probably not systems, but structures and processes and so forth kind of operate and look and identify, you know, where the intervention can be inserted and what the likely outcomes or the possible outcomes are, to anticipate some of, you know, we talk a lot about kind of unanticipated consequences or whatever, how we can go about anticipating what some consequences might be and trying to minimize, you know, any harm that might be associated with those. I think it's a really nice conceptualization of a way to kind of go into a complex situation and start thinking about how can we intervene in that situation in ways that are realistic, but also have some, likely potential for success. And they have one thing that she, makes clear, or they make clear, is that it is there needs to be some attention to specific context. There's no kind of one thing, one size fits all type of approach. So I would suggest kind of that might be one place to look for some ideas.
Another colleague wrote in the chat that we have developed some practical online tools with our partners to help agencies think through the types of theories that our colleague from South Africa has asked about. And then she gives a link to a website. So those who are interested can check out those websites, and we can put them on the Strive webpage. We have a section there of resources and linkages on these topics. I have one more now. I have a hand raised from Jameson Merrill, but I don't know if that was the last speaker or. Okay, the hand just
that was the last speaker.
Okay, all right. So just I'll leave it open. I have a final comment that I'll read from Barbara. But does anyone else have something they'd like to add before we close? And thank Kim for her really excellent overview. Okay, so I think what I'll do is Barbara basically says, great review. She's from UNAIDS. And she says, just a contribution on the implication of intervention, the term, I guess. UNAIDS has historically avoided the term because of its association with top-down, externally designed and driven actions upon audiences. But the technical definition is, quote, a series of actions designed and implemented in order to accomplish a specific objective, unquote. In the health field, defining the objective is relatively straightforward. So promote health or cure disease or prevent whatever. But as we talk more globally about promoting social justice or even broader social transformation, we often get a bit vague about defining the objective. It will be great to hear your thoughts on whether we can or should be more specific about objectives of social action and how we can be more concrete and specific about social change goals. She had to go, but she says thanks so much she loved the session. So that's a big question. Do you want to take a final comment on that and then we'll wrap up?
Oh boy. Well, I think the problem is, you can say what the objective is, but but there's so much underneath what that means. So you can say the objective. Again, the Parkhurst. The objective, and Kathy Campbell has some things. an AIDS competent community, AIDS resilience. But then. So, that's my objective. But then, what does that actually mean?
Right.
Unpacking that is the complicated. Even what did she say? She said, could you read her definition again?
She said the actual technical definition of the term intervention is a series of actions designed and implemented in order to accomplish a specific objective.
Right, and so supposedly it's easy, but it's all in the definition of that specific objective, right? And then there's I suppose here, for example, one of our a lot of HIV prevention policy now is really focused on community viral load and reducing. So I guess an objective would be reducing community viral load, and so there's a real emphasis on getting the idea is get everybody tested, get everybody into treatment, and then there won't be that many people with high, who have high viral load and are going to be transmitting the virus or whatever. And so I suppose you could say that you're developing the intervention to reduce community viral load, and you can you can measure community viral load, and the things that I've seen in D.C., where we have one of the more serious epidemics in the country, by the time you get to the measurement of viral load, the reduction of viral load, there's some, but there's not a whole lot. So I guess you could say that's a pretty concrete objective, and then it's all in what does it take to do that, and all the complexities of being able to accomplish that objective.